The coffee spilled before I even realized my hand had slipped, dark liquid spreading across his shirt, soaking into the expensive fabric, creating a stain so vivid that it felt like a slow-motion disaster unfolding before my eyes. My breath hitched, embarrassment flaring hot in my chest, hands scrambling for napkins, but the damage was done. The air between us shifted in an instant, no longer just the casual introduction I had expected but something heavier, more noticeable, as if the universe had decided that this moment needed to be burned into my memory. I muttered an apology, words tumbling out in a rush, my mind already cursing the sheer ridiculousness of my own clumsiness, especially today, especially now when I was about to meet my husband's nephew for the first time. His response wasn't irritation or frustration. It was something else entirely, something unexpected. A quiet chuckle, amusement laced in his voice, a subtle knowing smirk pulling at the corner of his lips as he took the napkin from my hand and dabbed at the stain. He wasn't flustered, wasn't annoyed, just looking at me with a calm curiosity that made my stomach tighten for reasons I couldn't quite define. His voice was smooth, effortless, the kind that settled in the air and lingered just a little too long, making it impossible to ignore. That was the first time I really saw him, not just as the vague, half-imagined figure I had created in my mind when my husband mentioned him in passing, but as a man standing in front of me, very much real, very much present, and nothing like what I had expected. I had assumed he'd be just another young man trying to find his place in the world, someone easily categorized, easily dismissed, someone with nervous energy or overcompensation, someone who still had edges to smooth out. But there was nothing hesitant about him, nothing uncertain. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, an ease that unsettled me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I told myself I was overanalyzing, that I was simply thrown off by the moment, but there was a flicker of something beneath my skin, something restless, something I didn't want to name. The drive home should have been uneventful, a quick half-hour from the airport to the house, but fate had other plans, stretching those 30 minutes into an agonizing 2-hour crawl of stop-and-go traffic that left us trapped together in the backseat while my husband remained occupied with work calls, oblivious to the way the atmosphere inside the car had shifted. At first, the conversation was surface-level, polite, the kind of obligatory small talk that comes with meeting someone new, but it didn't stay that way for long. What started as casual comments about travel and art turned into something deeper, something unspoken weaving itself between our words, drawing me in before I could stop it. He didn't just listen. He challenged, questioned, pushed for more, his insights sharp, his interest genuine, his mind effortlessly engaging in a way that made the world outside the car fade into insignificance. I found myself talking about things I hadn't discussed in years, not because I had forgotten them, but because no one had ever cared enough to ask. No one had ever matched my excitement, my curiosity, my hunger for ideas the way he did. He spoke about architecture the way I used to before compromises dulled my passion, before I learned to settle for what was practical, before I stopped believing that beauty could matter more than efficiency. By the time we reached the house, something inside me had shifted, something imperceptible yet undeniable, an awareness that hadn't been there before, a crack in the foundation of the life I had built so carefully. My husband greeted us briefly, a distracted nod, a quick pat on his nephew's shoulder before retreating into his office, phone pressed to his ear, his attention already elsewhere, already gone. It wasn't new, wasn't surprising, wasn't anything I hadn't accepted long ago as just the way things were, but tonight, for the first time in years, I noticed it in a way that made my chest tighten. Later, as I stood in front of my closet, fingers trailing over fabrics I hadn't worn in ages, I hesitated longer than I should have, lingering on a dress I hadn't reached for in years. A dress that made me feel something I had stopped allowing myself to feel. I told myself it didn't matter, that today had been nothing more than a long day, that my mind was simply playing tricks on me, that whatever I was feeling was irrelevant, fleeting, insignificant. But as I lay in bed hours later, eyes open in the dark, my husband's steady breathing beside me, I knew that was a lie. Something had shifted. Something had woken up. And I didn't know how to put it back to sleep. It started subtly, so quietly that I almost convinced myself it wasn't happening. Small moments slipping through the cracks of ordinary life. The kind of moments that could be brushed off as coincidence if not for the way they made my pulse shift, my breath hitch, my skin prickle with something dangerously close to anticipation. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just nice to be around someone who listened, who saw me, who noticed the things my husband had stopped noticing long ago. It wasn't about him, I reasoned, it was about the way I had forgotten what it felt like to be truly engaged, to be challenged, to be understood in ways that didn't require me to explain myself over and over. We spent more time together than I had anticipated, thrown into work discussions that bled into late afternoons, deep dives into design concepts that reignited something I thought had dulled beyond repair, his enthusiasm feeding my own until I found myself eager for our next conversation, my mind replaying his words long after he had left the room. He saw the details I had learned to bury, the parts of my work that had been smoothed over by years of compromises, the bolder ideas I had tucked away because practicality always won over vision. His eyes would light up when he pointed out something I had barely dared to hope someone would appreciate, and that recognition, that validation, sent a thrill through me that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with feeling truly, deeply understood. My husband never asked about the sketches I spent hours perfecting, never cared for the details that made a space breathe, never saw the artistry beneath the numbers and the logistics, but his nephew did, and that difference settled deep into my bones, impossible to ignore. The tension crept in slowly, woven into glances that lingered longer than necessary, into the way his fingers brushed against mine when passing a pen, into the way my breath caught when he leaned in too close over a blueprint, his voice low, focused, the warmth of his presence disrupting my ability to think clearly. I knew this was dangerous, knew that I should step back, create distance, draw lines where there were none, but I didn't. Instead, I let the moments stretch, let the silence between us hum with something unspoken, let myself want just a little, just enough to remind me that I was still capable of feeling something beyond routine, beyond obligation, beyond what was safe. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of the city mixed with something faintly metallic, the way rooftops always smelled after the sun had baked them all day. I wasn't supposed to be here, not with him, not like this, but when he had suggested stepping outside for fresh air after hours spent hunched over sketches and blueprints, I hadn't hesitated. The rooftop was quiet, removed from the rest of the house, the lights of the neighborhood stretching out in the distance, a reminder of how small we were compared to the world beyond us. He leaned against the low brick wall, arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon as if he were absorbing something I couldn't see, and for a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the street below and the quiet rhythm of our breathing. It should have felt awkward, the silence between us, but it didn't because I had long since stopped needing to fill the spaces between our conversations with empty words. It was strange how effortless it had become, how easy it was to exist in his presence without feeling like I had to be anything other than exactly who I was. He made a comment about one of my old designs, something I had barely remembered showing him, and when I laughed, it wasn't the forced, polite kind I had perfected over years of social niceties, but something genuine, something that bubbled up from a place I hadn't tapped into in a long time. He smirked, watching me, his gaze lingering just long enough to make me feel suddenly aware of myself in a way that was both exhilarating and unnerving. I reached for the railing, fingers tracing the cool metal, grounding myself in something solid, something real, because the way he was looking at me was dangerous, the kind of dangerous that made my pulse stutter and my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't supposed to be like this, wasn't supposed to feel like this, but then his hand brushed against mine, and it was the lightest touch, barely anything at all, yet it sent a shiver down my spine so sharp that I had to fight the instinct to step closer. I needed to leave, needed to put space between us before whatever this was unraveled into something I couldn't take back. But when I turned to go, he reached out, fingers circling my wrist in a way that wasn't forceful, wasn't demanding, but still stopped me in my tracks. My breath hitched, heart hammering in my chest, and when I met his eyes, I knew. There was no hesitation, no questioning, just the steady certainty of a moment that had been waiting to happen, stretching out between us like the inevitable pull of gravity. His lips met mine before I had time to think, before my mind could catch up to my body, and the world narrowed to the warmth of his mouth, the press of his fingers against my skin, the way my body betrayed me by leaning in instead of pulling away. It was brief, just a second, just long enough for the realization to hit me like a lightning strike, but when he pulled back, his eyes searching mine for a reaction, I couldn't find it in myself to be angry. I should have pushed him away, should have told him this was a mistake. But all I could feel was the echo of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, something raw and electric and terrifying in its intensity. I stepped back, forcing air into my lungs, shaking my head as if that would somehow undo what had just happened, as if it could erase the way my skin still tingled where he had touched me. He didn't apologize, didn't offer excuses, just held my gaze with an unreadable expression that made it clear he wasn't sorry, that he had known exactly what he was doing. I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. But long after I had closed the door behind me, long after I had buried myself under the covers of my bed, the memory of the kiss lingered, stubborn and unshakable, refusing to be ignored. I threw myself into routine as if structure alone could erase what had happened, filling every hour with work, dinner preparations, meaningless small talk with my husband, pretending that nothing had changed, that I hadn't felt my pulse race, that I hadn't spent half the night replaying the moment his lips met mine. I convinced myself that if I acted normal, if I went through the motions without hesitation, the memory would dull, the weight of it would lessen, and I would return to the woman I had been before, the one who never second-guessed her place in this house, in this marriage, in this life. My husband didn't notice the shift in me, didn't see the tension I was barely containing, too consumed with his endless phone calls, his emails, his meticulous schedules that left no room for questions, no space for doubts, no acknowledgement of the fact that his wife had kissed someone else on the rooftop while he was sitting just a few feet away inside, oblivious. At dinner, he talked about contracts and meetings, deadlines and figures, barely glancing up as I nodded at the right moments, my hands steady even as my mind spiraled. I should have been grateful for his blindness, for the way he existed in a world so separate from mine that he couldn't even sense the disruption beneath the surface. But instead, it made the silence between us feel more suffocating than ever, made it impossible not to compare the way his nephew had looked at me, listened to me, understood me in ways my husband never had. Avoiding him was harder than I expected, not because we were forced into the same spaces but because he made no attempt to leave them, moving through the house with the same confidence as before, his demeanor unchanged, his actions deliberate, as if he had already decided that what had happened between us wasn't a mistake at all. I ignored him when he entered a room, avoided his gaze when we crossed paths, spoke only when necessary, careful, controlled, certain that if I denied the moment long enough he would let it go, but he didn't. He was patient, relentless in a way that wasn't aggressive or demanding but impossible to ignore, his presence a constant reminder of what I was trying so desperately to forget. He never pushed, never cornered me, never spoke of it directly, but his eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking, lingering in a way that made my breath hitch, that made my resolve crack at the edges. I started losing focus in places where I never had before, found my mind wandering in meetings, my hands tightening on my coffee cup when I felt his presence too close, my skin prickling when he passed by without touching me, yet still leaving behind the ghost of something that refused to fade. I told myself it was just the guilt making me aware of him in ways I never had been before, just my own shame amplifying what had once been nothing, but the longer I ignored it, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just about me, that he knew, that he was waiting. I caught him watching me across the room one afternoon, the weight of his gaze pressing into me until I could feel it like a touch, and when I finally met his eyes, when I let myself hold his stare for just a second too long, I knew he had been waiting for me to break. I turned away before I could let myself linger, before I could give him anything more, before I could acknowledge what had passed between us in that quiet, charged second. But when I walked past him, when I tried to leave the room as if nothing had happened, his voice reached me in a whisper that sent a shiver down my spine, low, certain, undeniable. You felt it too. The words stopped me mid-step, a breath catching in my throat, my heart slamming against my ribs as every carefully built defense cracked just a little more, as the truth I had been trying to silence whispered back, undeniable, unshakable. Yes, I had felt it. Yes, I still felt it. Yes, it terrified me. But I didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him, didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer, because if I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to lie. Instead, I walked away, forcing one foot in front of the other, gripping the edges of my self-control with white-knuckled determination. But the echo of his voice followed me long after I had left the room, lingering in my mind like an open door I wasn't sure I had the strength to close. It started with a look, one I hadn't seen from him in years. A quiet scrutiny in the way his eyes lingered on me a second too long, studying, assessing, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized existed until now. He never asked direct questions, never demanded answers, but I could feel his curiosity pressing against the edges of my carefully controlled world. The slow unraveling of his indifference that had once felt like a blessing but now felt like a warning. His routine had always been predictable, his attention divided between work, investments, and business dinners, leaving little space for anything outside of his structured world. But suddenly he was paying attention, watching me in ways he hadn't in years, noticing things he had long since stopped noticing. He mentioned a trip over dinner, casually like it was an afterthought, but there was weight behind the suggestion, something pointed in the way he leaned back in his chair, waiting for my reaction, searching for something beneath the surface of my response. A weekend away, just the two of us, no work, no distractions, an opportunity to reconnect, as if years of distance could be undone with a few days in a different setting, as if time alone could bridge the silent space that had settled between us long before I had even met his nephew. I hesitated, almost said no, almost excused my way out of it with deadlines and obligations, but something in his expression made me stop, something almost unfamiliar, a flicker of effort where there had once been nothing, and for reasons I couldn't quite name, I agreed. The hotel was beautiful, the kind of place we used to visit in the early years when time together had felt like a luxury instead of an obligation, but now, walking through the grand lobby, I felt none of the excitement, none of the anticipation that used to come with these trips. The room was immaculate, a perfectly curated space designed for romance, yet all I could feel was the growing weight of expectation, the silent pressure of what this was supposed to be, what I knew he wanted it to be. Dinner was pleasant, wine poured into crystal glasses, candlelight flickering between us, but conversation felt like walking through a familiar house where the furniture had been rearranged, everything in place yet somehow unsettlingly different. He talked more than usual, asked questions about my work, my projects, things he never used to ask about, as if suddenly trying to reclaim a version of me he hadn't noticed slipping away, as if sensing that something was shifting and trying to pull it back before it was too late. I answered, smiled in the right places, let the illusion hold for as long as I could, but beneath the polished exterior, I felt hollow, detached, as if I were playing a role in a scene I had long since outgrown. When he reached across the table and took my hand, I didn't pull away, but I felt nothing, no spark, no warmth, just the weight of expectation settling in my chest, the knowledge that this moment was supposed to mean something but didn't. Later, in the quiet of our room, he kissed me, slow and deliberate, the way he used to when we were younger, when things had been easier, when I had wanted him in a way I could barely remember now, and I let it happen, let his hand settle on my waist, let my lips move against his, let the moment play out as it was supposed to, but there was nothing beneath it. No rush of emotion, no stir of longing, nothing but the distant realization that this was a man I had once loved, a man I had built a life with, a man who now felt like a stranger standing in front of me, trying to resurrect something that no longer existed. When he pulled back, searching my face for a reaction, I gave him a small smile, something that felt rehearsed even as I forced it onto my lips, and he seemed satisfied, unaware of the cold, sinking feeling settling deep in my stomach. That night, lying in bed beside him, his breathing slow and steady in the dark, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a restless storm of thoughts I couldn't silence, and for the first time I allowed myself to admit the truth I had been avoiding for far too long. My marriage wasn't just strained, wasn't just in need of repair. It was already gone, already beyond saving, and the realization wasn't painful, wasn't devastating, wasn't anything I had expected it to be. It was just quiet. A slow, undeniable acceptance of something that had been true for far longer than I had been willing to see. I stopped lying to myself, stopped pretending that what I felt was fleeting, stopped acting like it was something I could suppress with logic, routine, or the forced intimacy of a marriage that had already unraveled. I told myself I wasn't seeking him out, but I was finding ways to linger in the same spaces, to cross paths in moments that felt coincidental but weren't, to let silence stretch between us just long enough to feel the weight of it, the electricity humming beneath every glance, every breath, every unspoken word. He made it easy, never pushing, never forcing, just existing within arm's reach, waiting, watching, knowing that I was the one who would break first. I told myself it was harmless, that there was nothing wrong with the way we talked, the way we worked side by side, the way his voice always seemed to pull me in like a tide I had no desire to resist. We justified our time together through work, through projects that required discussion, through excuses that held up just well enough to quiet the last pieces of my conscience that still clung to reason. But it wasn't work, not really, not when I found myself anticipating our next interaction, not when I caught myself staring at his hands as he sketched, not when the air between us grew too thick with something unsaid, something inevitable. People started to notice before I was ready, before I had even fully accepted that there was something to notice. It was in the way conversations trailed off when we entered a room together, in the way eyes lingered a second too long, in the way my husband's closest colleague made a passing remark at a dinner party, his voice light but his expression sharp, his gaze cutting through my carefully constructed facade like a blade. You and him, he said, a casual sip of his drink, a tilt of his head in the nephew's direction. You two seem close. My stomach twisted, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass, the unspoken implication crackling in the space between us like static before a storm. I forced a laugh, dismissed it as ridiculous, but his eyes never wavered, amusement flickering across his face like he was waiting for me to trip over my own denial. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being paranoid, but once the thought had been placed in my mind, I couldn't shake it. I started to see what they saw, the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching, the way I leaned in just a little too much when we spoke, the way our movements mirrored each other's like a dance we hadn't consciously learned but had somehow perfected. I tried to put space between us, to re-establish the boundaries I had so carelessly let dissolve, but every time I pulled back something stronger pulled me forward, some force that felt bigger than both of us, more undeniable than logic, more intoxicating than restraint. He didn't need to touch me to make my pulse stutter, didn't need to say anything for me to know exactly what he was thinking, didn't need to remind me of the kiss because it never left my mind, never stopped replaying in the quiet moments, in the spaces where I should have been thinking about anything but him. And then it happened, the question that shattered every illusion of secrecy, the words that sent ice through my veins even as something deep inside me burned hotter. It came from someone I respected, someone who had never pried, never meddled, never asked more than was appropriate, and that only made it worse. She said it with a tilt of her head, with a tone that was soft, almost concerned, but there was steel beneath the words, an edge that cut straight through my carefully constructed denials. Are you sure your marriage is okay? The air left my lungs in a rush, my response catching in my throat, my mind scrambling for a lie that would sound believable, but nothing came. I could only manage a small, tight-lipped smile, something brittle, something that felt like it would crack under the weight of even the slightest pressure. And in that moment, I knew she saw right through me. She didn't press, didn't push, just held my gaze for a beat too long before turning away, leaving me standing there with the weight of my own choices pressing down on me like an avalanche I had no way of outrunning. It happened too fast, too carelessly, the kind of mistake that couldn't be undone, the kind that slipped through the cracks of careful secrecy and turned into something undeniable. It was late, later than it should have been, the inside of the car dimly lit by the amber glow of a street lamp, the city quiet around us in that strange in-between hour where the world hadn't quite settled but hadn't fully woken either. We hadn't meant to be here together, hadn't planned for it, but circumstances had aligned in that dangerous way they always seem to, leading us to this moment, alone, side by side, the space between us shrinking with every breath, with every shared glance that lingered a second too long. I should have left sooner, should have walked away before it got to this point, but I hadn't, and that was the mistake because someone saw. A figure in the distance, barely more than a shadow, but enough, just enough to be a problem, enough to set everything into motion, enough to turn a quiet secret into something that couldn't be ignored. The rumors spread faster than I thought they would, slipping through conversations like smoke, curling around corners, whispered in hushed tones that carried just far enough to make my skin prickle every time I walked into a room. I could feel the shift before I even heard the words, in the way people hesitated before speaking to me, in the fleeting glances exchanged behind my back, in the polite, too careful way certain friends suddenly interacted with my husband, as if they knew something they weren't sure how to tell him. I told myself I was being paranoid, that no one could possibly know for certain, that what had happened in that car was nothing more than a passing moment that had been misinterpreted, but deep down I knew better. The truth had started to leak, slow but steady, a crack in the foundation that was widening with every second, and no amount of denial could hold it together. Then the message came, short, simple, damning. Be careful. Your wife is acting strange. No name, no explanation, just enough to plant the seed of suspicion, just enough to make my stomach drop when I saw my husband reading it, his face unreadable, his expression carefully neutral in the way that only meant one thing. He wasn't ignoring it. He didn't ask me about it, didn't say a word, but that silence was worse than confrontation, worse than anything he could have said, because silence meant he was watching, waiting, collecting evidence in his mind before making a move. I spent the rest of the night in a state of barely contained panic, my mind running through every possibility, every scenario, every potential excuse that could erase whatever doubts he had. But the one person who wasn't panicking was him. He was calm, composed, completely unshaken, as if none of this mattered, as if the walls weren't closing in, as if the risk didn't exist at all. He caught me alone the next morning, his eyes steady, his voice even, nothing but quiet certainty in the way he spoke. "It doesn't change anything," he said, and I wanted to believe that was true, wanted to believe that we could still exist inside this fragile, breaking thing without it shattering completely. But I wasn't like him, wasn't fearless in the face of exposure, wasn't ready to burn everything to the ground just to see what remained. He was willing to see it through, willing to push forward no matter the cost, but I was the one with everything to lose, the one whose life was built on a foundation that was now dangerously close to collapsing. And yet, as much as I wanted to stop, as much as I told myself I should, I knew that I wouldn't, knew that I couldn't, knew that whatever fear had rooted itself inside me wasn't strong enough to pull me away. I had already gone too far. I had already made my choice. And there was no turning back now. I had stopped being careful, stopped calculating every risk, stopped worrying about what would happen if the truth ever came out, because I had convinced myself that I could control it, that I could manage the balance between what I wanted and what I wasn't willing to lose. I had built my lies so carefully, had crafted my excuses so seamlessly, had let myself believe that as long as no one said the words out loud, then none of it was real. But reality doesn't wait for permission, doesn't pause to let you prepare, doesn't knock before it walks in and sets fire to everything you thought was safe. It happened fast, so fast that I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to react, didn't have time to stop what was already in motion. One moment we were alone, the walls of the house wrapped around us like a secret, his hands on my waist, his breath warm against my skin, my mind blank except for the pull between us that had already won too many times. And then the door opened. I felt it before I saw him, felt the shift in the air, the sudden drop in temperature, the weight of something irreversible pressing against my ribs before my brain could even register what had happened. My husband stood in the doorway, silent, still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told me everything. The pieces clicked together for him in an instant, the unanswered questions, the subtle shifts, the whispers he hadn't wanted to believe, all of it crystallizing into something undeniable, something so painfully obvious that I almost laughed at how foolish I had been to think this moment wouldn't come. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything except watch, and that was somehow worse than anger, worse than accusations, worse than the explosion I had been bracing myself for. Because anger would have meant emotion, would have meant that he still cared enough to fight, would have meant that there was still something left between us worth destroying. But this quiet, hollow silence, was nothing but the sound of something ending. And then, as if the world had decided that there wasn't enough destruction in the room already, as if fate had decided that the knife needed to be pushed just a little deeper, I felt his hand on my face, tilting my chin, and before I could stop it, before I could even think to pull away, the nephew kissed me. It wasn't an accident, wasn't a mistake, wasn't something I could explain away, and I knew the moment our lips met that it wasn't for me, wasn't for him, wasn't for us. It was for the man standing in the doorway. It was proof. A confirmation. A final nail in the coffin of a marriage that had already been 6 feet under long before tonight. My husband didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't do anything except watch, his face carved from stone, his eyes empty in a way that made my stomach turn, my skin prickle with something colder than fear. There was no rage, no betrayal written across his features, just quiet resignation, just a man realizing that he had already lost long before he had even known there was a battle to fight. The moment stretched unbearably long, suffocating in its silence, the weight of it pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. And then, without a word, without a single glance back, he turned and walked away. No questions. No accusations. No demands for explanations that we both knew would mean nothing. Just a quiet, measured exit, as if he was closing the door on something that no longer belonged to him, as if he had already let go before I had even realized I was slipping away. And that was the moment I knew, I hadn't just been caught. I had been left. The silence was worse than anything I had imagined, worse than shouting, worse than accusations, worse than rage, because silence was final, silence was absence, silence was a decision made without discussion, without room for negotiation. He didn't argue, didn't demand answers, didn't even look at me the same way, just moved through the house like a ghost, like a man who had already left even though his things were still here, his scent still lingered, his presence still occupied the same space as I did. He came home late, left early, spent hours locked in his office or out at meetings that may or may not have actually existed, but either way he wasn't here, not in any way that mattered. At first I convinced myself that it was temporary, that we would talk, that I could explain, that there was still something to salvage, but every time I opened my mouth, The weight of his indifference crushed whatever words I thought I had. When I finally forced the confrontation, finally cornered him in the kitchen one evening, the exhaustion in his eyes told me everything before he even spoke. "You made your choice," he said, voice even, detached, as if he was discussing a business deal that had already fallen through. "I'm just following through with it." And then he walked away, not out of anger, not out of spite, but because he had nothing left to say to me. I reached for the only other person I had left, the only one who had made me forget, the only one who had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years, but that door was already closing too. He wasn't cruel, wasn't unkind, wasn't anything except exactly what I should have expected him to be. Young, reckless, selfish in a way that only people without real consequences could afford to be. For him, this had been excitement, had been an escape, had been something thrilling and intoxicating until it wasn't, until it became real, until it became messy, until it came with responsibilities that he never wanted. He stopped coming around as much, stopped answering as quickly, started giving excuses that felt like placeholders until the inevitable goodbye that neither of us wanted to say but both knew was coming. And when it finally happened, when I asked him if he was leaving, if this was over, if I had ruined everything for nothing, he didn't lie, didn't sugarcoat, didn't try to offer me anything except the truth I should have seen from the beginning. "I didn't ask you to do this," he said, quiet, final, the words cutting sharper than I expected. "You made that choice yourself." And that was it. No promises, no lingering moments of regret, no dramatic declarations of love or guilt, just reality settling in, just the weight of what I had done crashing down around me. Just the cold, sinking realization that I had thrown my entire life into the fire for something that had never been built to last. I had believed in the illusion of something more, had convinced myself that this was different, that this was worth everything, but now, standing in the ruins of the life I had once known, I saw it for what it really was. I wasn't the love of his life. I wasn't his future. I wasn't anything except a mistake he no longer wanted to be attached to. And so I was alone. No husband, no lover, no future that I could recognize, just the empty spaces of a house that no longer felt like home, just the weight of my choices pressing down on me with every breath, just the quiet, cruel understanding that I had done this to myself. The months passed in a slow, unremarkable blur, days bleeding into each other with nothing to mark the difference between them except the growing emptiness of a life that no longer belonged to me. The house was quieter now, not in the peaceful way it used to be when my husband was working late or away on business, but in the hollow, suffocating way that came when a space had been abandoned emotionally long before it was physically empty. He was still here technically, still occupying the same rooms, still moving through the motions of a life we had built together, but he wasn't present, wasn't reachable, wasn't anything except a man waiting for the final steps of a process he had already decided on. There were no fights, no last attempts to salvage what had long since died, no emotional outbursts or desperate pleas for another chance, just the slow, steady dismantling of something that had already been broken beyond repair. When the papers arrived, neatly stacked on the kitchen counter beside my untouched morning coffee, there was no note, no explanation, no final conversation to frame the end of a marriage that had once been my entire world. Just a quiet confirmation of what I had already known. A choice made without hesitation, without anger, without a single glance back. I signed them without crying, without shaking, without feeling much of anything at all, because what was there left to feel when you had already lost everything? I had spent weeks convincing myself that there was still something salvageable, that maybe if I could just explain, just find the right words, just prove that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen, he would look at me again, would see me again, but he never did. He had let go long before I had already started moving forward while I was still trying to piece together a past that no longer existed, and now, with the ink drying on the final papers, there was nothing left to hold on to. I told myself I wouldn't look, that I wouldn't seek out the proof of what I already suspected, but curiosity was a cruel thing, a relentless whisper in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced. It didn't take long to find it, didn't take much effort at all, because he wasn't hiding, wasn't avoiding, wasn't doing anything except living his life as if I had never been a part of it. A picture on social media, a fleeting mention from a mutual acquaintance, a name I didn't recognize but now would never forget, the woman who had replaced me before I had even fully accepted that I was gone. He had moved on, had found something new, something unburdened by consequences and guilt, something that wasn't a mistake, and the ease of it, the simplicity of it, the way he had so effortlessly let go of me while I was still drowning in the wreckage of my own choices, made my stomach twist with something I refused to name. It hadn't meant anything to him, not really, not in the way I had let myself believe, not in the way that had justified everything I had destroyed. I had gambled everything for something fleeting, something temporary, something that had never belonged to me in the first place, and now that the dust had settled, I was the only one left standing in the ruins. The house was too big now, too quiet, too full of ghosts that I couldn't outrun, memories pressed into the walls like fingerprints that wouldn't fade no matter how many times I tried to scrub them away. I found myself in front of the mirror, studying my reflection with an eerie detachment, trying to recognize the woman staring back at me, trying to find some trace of the person I had once been before I had thrown her away. She looked the same, on the surface at least, the same eyes, the same lips, the same carefully maintained features, but there was something different now, something hollow, something lost, something irreversible. I had wanted something more, something that made me feel alive, something that reminded me of who I used to be, but all I had found was this: an empty house, an empty life, an empty reflection of a woman who had ruined everything for a moment of weakness. And the worst part? There was no one left to blame but myself.